Poor Black Boy Saves Millionaire's Dog. A story that will leave you speechless. What happens halfway through the story changes everything. We'd love to know where you're watching this video from, so leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and don't forget to hit the notification bell to stay updated on all our content. In a city where luxury knew no bounds, Gold District stood as the epitome of opulence. Mansions rose like palaces, with pristine gardens, sculptural fountains, and sleek sports cars gliding along quiet streets. But behind all that wealth, there was a quiet figure that many overlooked: David. At 12 years old, he was the son of Tsida, a housekeeper working for the wealthy and eccentric Mrs. Adelaide, heiress to a jewelry empire. While his mother toiled away with exhausting work hours, David was always around, curious and attentive to the world around him. David, a black boy with lively eyes, spent his days between the humble community where he lived and the mansions of the district, accompanying his mother. Curious from a young age, he was fascinated by the stark contrast between his life and that of the wealthy employers. Whenever he could, he explored the vast mansion gardens and played with Fred, Mrs. Adelaide's white Pomeranian, a dog worth a small fortune. Fred was the only creature that seemed to give David the attention he deserved, always running to him whenever he saw him. Mrs. Adelaide, an elegant woman in her 60s, was a widow living alone in a monumental mansion. Her jewelry empire had been left as an inheritance from her late husband, and since then, her greatest companion was Fred. The dog, with his silky white fur, was treated like a prince. A special diet, a routine of care with renowned vets, and even a custom bed. Despite her isolated life and apparent coldness, Adelaide harbored a silent affection for David. Though he was just the son of her housekeeper, she noticed his sharp intelligence. On several occasions, she overheard him talking with the staff about complex topics, making him stand out for his age. Deep down, she admired that humble boy. One day, during one of Fred's usual strolls around the mansion, something happened that would completely disrupt the neighborhood's peace. The dog, who always ran joyfully through the flower beds, disappeared. At first, Adelaide thought he was just hiding, as he sometimes did, but hours passed and Fred didn't return. The house was gripped by anxiety. Then a mysterious note appeared at the mansion's door. "If you want Fred back, prepare to pay a high price." The entire neighborhood went into a frenzy. The wealthy families feared that if Fred had been kidnapped, any of them could be the next target. The police were called, and the case quickly grew into an alarming situation. The sensationalist media spread the news like wildfire, turning Fred's disappearance into a spectacle of tragedy and mystery. David, always observant of the world around him, couldn't ignore the tension. He knew something was wrong, and with his keen mind, he began to notice details that the police overlooked. He had noticed strange movements around the community where he lived, unfamiliar men, cars that had never been seen before. David's restless mind soon connected dots that the adults, busy with their own lives, missed. While Adelaide was tormented by Fred's disappearance, the boy was preparing to follow clues on his own, without realizing how deep this mystery would take him. As the police led fruitless investigations, David decided to trust his instincts. He knew Fred like no one else, understood his habits, the places he liked, and, more importantly, he knew the surroundings of his community like the back of his hand. One afternoon, while walking along the streets that separated the wealthy neighborhood from his own, David spotted something that caught his attention. A tall man, with a suspicious expression, carrying a heavy bag as he got out of a car that seemed out of place. David watched from a distance and, curious as ever, decided to follow him discreetly. The man entered an alley, but as he walked away from the car, one thing became clear to the boy: the muffled sound coming from the bag. He followed the man for a while, but before he could get any closer, the man disappeared into an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city. David knew he couldn't handle this on his own. At least, not yet. He returned home with a mix of fear and excitement. He had to find out more, but carefully. That night, he barely slept. Something was happening, something he knew he could solve. But how? How could a 12-year-old boy take on the criminal world? Little did he know, what he was about to uncover was far bigger than just a dog kidnapping. The next day, David returned to the warehouse, this time more prepared. He knew he had to be cautious, so he dressed in dark clothes and hid in the shadows, watching the area. The warehouse was tucked away from the main streets, a perfect spot for illegal activities without drawing attention. David knew he was taking a huge risk, but something inside him, a nearly visceral sense of justice, pushed him forward. He found a strategic observation point and waited patiently for something to happen. Hours passed, and David began to doubt that anything would. However, just as the afternoon was ending, the iron gate of the warehouse creaked, and two men stepped out. They seemed tense, whispering to each other. David crouched lower to avoid being seen, but he could hear a few key words that made him freeze. Ransom, boss, delivery. Fred was there. He was sure of it. David took a deep breath and decided he wouldn't leave empty-handed. As soon as the men disappeared into the distance, he slowly approached the warehouse entrance. The place was large and dimly lit, with rusty hallways and disorganized piles of crates. The silence was eerie. David's heart pounded as he moved towards the back of the warehouse, where he believed Fred might be. Suddenly, a faint noise broke the silence, a muffled bark. There he was. David followed the sound until he found Fred locked in a large cage. The dog's expression scared but relieved to see the familiar face of the boy. David knew he didn't have much time before the kidnappers returned. Without hesitation, he started looking for a way to open the cage. The lock holding Fred was heavy, and David didn't have the right tools to break it. He tried forcing it with his hands, but it was no use. He knew he had to act fast, so he searched the nearby crates until he found a metal bar. With a lot of effort and patience, he managed to break the lock, freeing Fred. The dog, despite the fright, immediately recognized David and jumped into his arms, wagging his tail with contagious joy. However, David's relief was cut short by a terrifying sound: footsteps returning towards the warehouse. The kidnappers were coming back. David clutched Fred in his arms, feeling the small Pomeranian tremble with fear against his chest. They were in the middle of an abandoned warehouse, surrounded by danger that seemed to grow closer with each passing second. David had managed to free the dog, but now came the hardest part: escaping without being seen. The sound of footsteps echoing through the warehouse signaled the return of the kidnappers. David's heart hammered in his ears as he desperately looked for a way out. Scanning the area, he spotted a small broken window high up on one of the side walls. It was their only chance. Holding Fred tightly, David ran toward a stack of crates and, with effort, began climbing them. His arms ached as he tried to balance both Fred and himself, but there was no time to hesitate. The window seemed far, almost unreachable for a boy his age, but he knew he couldn't give up. Fear pushed him forward, and the need to save Fred overcame any fatigue or doubt. Finally, reaching the top of the crates, he looked at the small opening in the wall. The window was partially shattered, with shards of glass still clinging to the frame. David knew he had to be careful. He tucked Fred under his left arm and, with his right hand, cautiously pushed the remaining glass pieces aside, trying to make enough space for both of them to pass through without getting hurt. As he did this, he heard the kidnappers' footsteps again, now even closer. David hurried. With one last push, he cleared enough space to fit. He gently pushed Fred through the window, the dog landing softly in the alley outside, waiting anxiously for his young rescuer. Now it was David's turn. He grabbed the window's ledge and pulled himself up, struggling to squeeze his slender body through the narrow opening. The effort was enormous, his muscles shaking from the strain, but he knew he couldn't stop. The kidnappers were just seconds away from finding him. When he finally managed to get through the window, David fell into the alley with a thud, his knees scraping on the ground upon impact. Pain shot through his body, but he ignored it. Grabbing Fred again, he started running. The alley was dark and narrow, with piles of trash and debris scattered along the ground, making his escape even more difficult. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, panting, his heart still racing. He could hear the distant shouts of the kidnappers, who had finally realized Fred was gone. David knew they weren't far behind and could catch up at any moment. Turning the corner of the alley, David reached the main street of his community. It was dark, and the streetlights barely lit the way. David knew that if he could reach a more populated area, he might be able to escape the kidnappers for good. So, he kept running, with Fred nestled in his arms, barking softly, as if sensing the fear and tension of the moment. David only stopped running when he felt he was safe, in a part of the community where the kidnappers wouldn't dare to follow. He hid in an abandoned house, where he knew he could keep Fred temporarily while he figured out the next step. Sitting on the floor of the house, panting and exhausted, David hugged Fred, who curled up in his lap, now calmer. The relief of having escaped with his life was immense, but David knew he wasn't out of danger yet. He had to find a way to return Fred to Mrs. Adelaide without the kidnappers finding out. And more than that, he knew this situation was only part of something much bigger. Those men didn't seem like simple criminals looking for easy money. There was something else at play, something he couldn't fully understand yet. Fred's kidnapping wasn't just a random scheme. David felt the mystery was about to deepen, and he was determined to uncover the truth. As David tried to sleep that night, a series of questions flooded his mind. Fred's kidnapping seemed like more than just a ploy for money. He couldn't shake the feeling that something much bigger was at stake. The words he overheard from the kidnappers, boss and delivery, spun in his head, but he didn't know how to piece them together yet. The next day, David hurried to check on Fred, who was still hidden in the abandoned house. The dog was fine, excited to see his young hero again, but David knew he couldn't keep Fred there much longer. He had to return him to Mrs. Adelaide, but safely, without attracting the kidnappers' attention. However, before that, he needed answers. David decided to return to Mrs. Adelaide's mansion, discreetly, pretending to help his mother. He snuck through the house until he found Adelaide in her private library, a place that had always fascinated him. Tall bookshelves full of old books, maps, and documents covered the walls. But what really caught his attention was an old wooden box on Adelaide's desk. Adelaide was distracted, talking on the phone with her lawyer about Fred's kidnapping. David saw an opportunity and, while the elderly woman had her back turned, he approached the box. His gut told him that something inside might explain the mysteries surrounding the case. With trembling fingers, he opened the lid and found a series of old letters and documents. He began reading quickly through the first few lines and soon realized he was looking at a family secret. The letters spoke of a dark deal made by Adelaide's late husband. It seemed that, many years ago, before building the jewelry empire, Adelaide's husband had done shady business with dangerous people who were apparently still lurking, waiting for a chance to retaliate. Among the letters, one phrase stood out and sent chills down David's spine. The debt will be collected with something more precious than gold. Fred wasn't just a valuable dog. He represented the payment for a very old debt. At that moment, Adelaide turned and saw David holding the letters. Her eyes widened, not with anger but with desperation. She knew the boy had uncovered something she had tried to hide for a long time. With a serious, emotional tone, she approached David, looking him in the eyes. "I never wanted it to come to this, David," she said, her voice breaking. "But there are things about my family that even I can't control." David realized that Adelaide wasn't the cold, untouchable figure she appeared to be. She was haunted by secrets from the past, and Fred's kidnapping was just the tip of a much larger iceberg. Adelaide, realizing she could no longer keep the truth hidden, began to tell David her family's story. She explained that decades ago, her family's jewelry empire was built not only with talent and hard work, but also with dangerous alliances. Her husband, an ambitious man, had gotten involved in illicit dealings to expand his fortune. At first, everything seemed under control, but as the years passed, those alliances became a threat. "When my husband died, I thought it was all over," said Adelaide, sitting down in an armchair, exhausted. "But I was wrong. They never forgot." David listened carefully, processing the new information. Now Fred's kidnapping made sense. For Adelaide, the dog was like a living jewel, something that represented what she loved most. To the kidnappers, Fred was the perfect symbol to demand payment for an old debt. Adelaide knew she couldn't go to the police with this story. It would ruin her name and destroy the empire she had built over the years. The only person who could help her was David, the boy who had already shown uncommon courage and a pure heart. "I trust you, David," she said, tears in her eyes. I need your help to get Fred back safely." David, though scared, felt an enormous sense of responsibility. He knew he was dealing with something far beyond his abilities, but he couldn't back down now. Adelaide was more than just his mother's employer. At that moment, she was a vulnerable woman asking for help, and he, with his pure heart and sharp mind, knew he couldn't let her down. With a plan forming in his mind, David decided that the first step was to make the kidnappers believe they still had control of the situation. He suggested to Adelaide that they respond to the ransom demand, but in a way that would give him time to act. David knew he had to be clever. His idea was to set a trap for the kidnappers, taking advantage of their confidence that Adelaide would pay the ransom without question. He decided to involve more people from the community, trusted individuals who could help without raising suspicion. Among them was his best friend, Marcos, a boy the same age as David who was great with technology. With Marcos's help, David devised a plan to track the kidnappers' communications. They needed to know exactly where and when the ransom would be delivered. The goal was to catch the kidnappers red-handed, but David knew that any mistake could put Fred and himself in danger. Meanwhile, Adelaide pretended to follow the criminals' demands. She gathered the ransom money, following the instructions sent in a new note, but with one difference: David had hidden a tracking device in the package. The meeting was set for a dark night in a deserted park on the outskirts of the city. When the day of the ransom arrived, David's heart was racing. He knew he couldn't afford to make mistakes. If anything went wrong, Fred could be lost forever, and he himself could be in serious danger. Night fell faster than David had anticipated. The sky was filled with dark clouds, creating a grim atmosphere for the encounter that promised to change everything. Adelaide was visibly tense, but stuck to the plan. She went to the park carrying the package with the ransom, while David and Marcos watched from a distance, hidden behind a line of tall bushes, equipped with the tracker that had been placed in the package. The park was empty and quiet, except for the distant sounds of the city. A shadowy figure appeared at the entrance of the park, walking with firm, calculated steps toward Adelaide. It was one of the kidnappers. He wore a black mask and a heavy coat, making identification difficult. "Did you bring what I asked for?" His voice was cold, emotionless, as he stared directly at Adelaide. "Yes, it's all here," she replied, trying to stay calm, though her voice trembled slightly. "Now tell me, where is Fred?" The man didn't respond immediately. He took the package and examined it briefly, as if checking if everything was in order. David and Marcos, watching from afar, monitored the tracker. So far, everything was going according to plan, but something unexpected happened. The kidnapper, without giving any explanation, turned and began walking toward a car parked nearby. He made no move to release Fred. David knew it was now or never. He couldn't wait any longer. With a quick signal to Marcos, the two boys started following the tracker, keeping enough distance not to be seen. They needed to find out where Fred was being held and ensure the ransom plan succeeded. The car sped off, leaving the park and heading out of the city. David and Marcos managed to follow the signal until they reached a place even more ominous than the previous warehouse. A warehouse on the city's outskirts, surrounded by high walls and security cameras. It seemed impossible to get inside without being detected. "We're in the lion's den now," Marcos whispered, visibly worried. But David wasn't willing to give up. He knew Fred was inside, and he couldn't return empty-handed. They needed a plan, and quickly began searching for a way to get in without being seen. David and Marcos circled the perimeter of the warehouse, trying to find a weak spot. There was a small fence at the back, near what seemed to be a loading dock. It looked like the least guarded area. With great caution, they climbed the fence and entered the warehouse grounds. The place was deserted. Only the occasional sound of footsteps echoed, probably from the guards patrolling the area. David and Marcos moved silently, their eyes scanning every corner, until they found a side door. It was slightly ajar. David's heart raced. Was Fred in there? When they entered, they realized the warehouse was much larger than it looked from the outside. Long, dark corridors stretched in all directions, filled with crates and industrial equipment. Following the sound of a muffled bark, they reached a room in the back. There, chained to a small leash, was Fred, scared but still alive. "We did it," Marcos whispered, smiling at David. But the relief was short-lived. As David knelt to free Fred, one of the guards appeared at the door, catching them by surprise. The man drew a gun, pointing it directly at them. "Do you think it works like this?" the man said with a malicious grin. "Do you think you're just going to walk out of here?" David froze. What would they do now? Everything seemed lost. In that moment of maximum tension, an unexpected figure entered the room. It was the masked kidnapper, but now without his mask, revealing something shocking. It was Augusto, Mrs. Adelaide's trusted lawyer. The shock was instant. David could hardly believe what he was seeing. "Augusto, you're behind all of this?" David asked, still in disbelief. "Yes, clever boy. I was tired of being in that woman's shadow, working for her while she enjoyed all the fortune. This was my plan to finally take a part of what is rightfully mine." Fred's kidnapping was just the beginning. Augusto, who for years had been Adelaide's trusted lawyer, was behind the entire scheme. He had planned the kidnapping to extort money from his own boss, but his true intention was much darker. He wanted to take control of the jewelry empire, gradually eliminating Adelaide. Fred's ransom was just one step in his plan to destroy the woman and seize her legacy. "And now, you two aren't going to leave here to tell this story," Augusto said, drawing a gun from his waist. David knew he couldn't panic. Fred started barking, the sound echoing through the room. Augusto took a step forward, but at that moment, Marcos, in an act of courage, threw himself against the kidnapper, knocking him to the ground. The gun slipped from his hands, and David, quick as lightning, grabbed Fred and bolted towards the door. "Come on, Marcos," David yelled, as the two boys sprinted for the exit. The boys fled out of the warehouse, running as fast as they could. The sound of footsteps behind them indicated the guards were in pursuit, but luckily, a police patrol, called by Adelaide after realizing something was wrong with the ransom plan, arrived just in time. The kidnappers were arrested, and Augusto was taken into custody, gradually revealing his diabolical plan to take over Adelaide's fortune. The truth came to light, and the once peaceful neighborhood would never be the same. David, the humble boy from the community, became the hero who not only saved Fred but also Mrs. Adelaide's legacy. The bond between them grew even stronger. She publicly acknowledged David's bravery, and the story of the little hero spread throughout the city. Adelaide, now free from Augusto's shadow, made a surprising decision. She made David the heir to part of her empire. The boy who had started the story as the son of a housekeeper was now destined for a future of opportunities. David's courage transcended social barriers, proving that heroes can emerge from anywhere, even the most humble corners.